Abused Doberman, left for dead in Texas. What this old man did next will break you. I saw him in the market like a monster that didn't bother to hide itself. A rusted chain in one hand, his face is smeared with drink. The whites of his eyes bloodshot and hard as coals. And he was striking the Doberman again and again, not a single corrective smack. Not anything meant to teach, but blows delivered to sate some ugly knot of grief and rage in his chest, violence used like a tool to empty himself. The whip cracked on flesh and threw dust into the air, tore the fabric of the dog's pants, pushed the crowd back in a stunned ring of silence that felt like a sick circus. It was obscene. The dog collapsed onto the dry ground, and each lash left a mark in the skin. The wounds, not fresh rivers of red, but crusted dark smears caught in the fur like stains that won't wash out, and it didn't howl like the movies. It made a single brittle moan that split the air thin and weak as a dead leaf about to fall. Its eyes were hollowed, its face, filthy ribs showing like a wooden frame under stretched canvas, and every time it tried to lift its head, its whole body trembled with pain. I could hear the smallness of it more than anything. Around us, people wore the faces of indifference. Some raised phones and filmed eyes flat as if hunting a clip for social media. A vegetable vendor sighed and turned away. A kid sneered, "Let's see what it does." And no one stepped forward. No one shouted, "Stop!" Nobody did what needed doing. The silence of bystanders pressed on me until something inside boiled a coarse rage, wanting to smash that silence apart and make the world answer. I could not stand it. I stepped forward and shouted, my voice ragged and trembling, not from fear, but from fury. "Stop it now? Are you some kind of monster?" He whirled, eyes wide, lips muttering, "Mind your own business, it's mine." And he raised his hand like he would keep going. A part of me wanted to strike him back. A part wanted to choke him until he shut up, and I spat the words straight at him. "You cruel bastard, you're a dog, not a man." The crowd went colder. Phones kept filming. My hands shook as I pulled out my phone and called the police, giving them each word, "Animal abuse at Riverside Market." "Send a unit now." He roared and cursed and threatened to smash me, and I looked him dead in the eye and said, "Try it." Somewhere a siren wailed in the distance someone must have heard. It was a small sound, but it felt like hope. When he was finally restrained, I dropped to my knees beside the dog, my hands filthy with dust, and the stench of booze clinging to them, and I lifted it. Its body was lighter than I expected, as if a little universe was about to go out. Its shivered bruises purpled under its skin. Its head swollen like a bruised fruit, fever heat pulsing through its coat. One eye opened a slit and looked at me with a plea folded into suspicion. "If you save me, will you leave me too?" I held it close. That old numb chill that had lived in me for 4 lonely years cracked open and fell away into a simple decision: I would not leave it. I whispered, my voice rough but steady, "I'm taking you. I'm sorry there are people like them." Phones still swung behind me, still recording the moment. I didn't care. The only thing that mattered now was to take that life away from those heartless hands and get it somewhere safe. I've lived in Riverside County for more than 60 years, in a wooden house about 3 miles from the market by a river that used to be full of fish and laughter and is now only mud and wind, and since Mary died, that house has been nothing but a hollow box where mornings begin and end in the same small ritual. I make coffee, watch the steam rise from the cup and wait for it to cool, as if I'm waiting for the rest of my life to finish drifting away. I stopped talking to people, stopped going to the diner, stopped going to church. Mary's chair still sits on the porch, but I don't dare sit in it. Empty. Mary loved animals. She used to say, "John people don't need pretty words. They just need to be gentle to those who are weaker than them," and I used to laugh and think she was being sentimental and foolish, and now I hate myself for understanding her too late. The image of that Doberman at the market kept replaying in my head after that day, every moment folding into the next. The whip cracking the dog's small moan, the wind carrying the smell of dried blood. I didn't sleep that night. I put the dog in my old truck. My 1975 Chevrolet coughed to life, and the headlights cut through a haze of red dust as it sat on the passenger seat breathing small, rusty breaths that sounded like wind through a grate, and I drove with one hand on the wheel and one on the dog, terrified that one corner might be the corner where it stopped breathing. The smell of burned grass and old liquor slipped through the open window, the same stench that had clung to the man, a smell of guilt and indifference, and I watched the road and counted every shallow breath like a heartbeat. I feared the silence that follows. On the way, I ran into folks I'd known all my life. Mr. Harris at the garage only glanced over and said, "You getting into trouble again?" John and I said if you'd seen it, you'd do the same. And he gave a thin smile and shrugged. Around here, everyone sees. Nobody wants the bother. That line hit like a punch. People see, and they choose silence. That's the way this town lived, and the way Mary died in the quiet and the shrug of people who wouldn't meet the trouble. Quiet kills. Riverside Animal Care sits at the end of the old road, a rusted sign, a flickering bulb, and when I banged on the door, Elaine Foster, my old friend from younger days, opened it with a look of shock. I set the dog on the stainless table and said, "Save him, Elaine, please." She looked at it, and her professional irritation melted into pure horror. Dried blood bruises, maybe broken bones. She said it like a list of things that shouldn't be, and I gripped her hand and told her I can feel it. He's barely holding on, but he's alive. Beep came the first weak sound from the monitor, a sound so small it could have been a promise. This dog has a high fever, severe dehydration, head swelling, possible brain trauma, Elaine whispered, and she asked me about costs about my age. And then she said softly, "You don't have to do this, John. At your age, you don't have the strength." I said, "It doesn't need my strength. It needs a chance." I sat back in a corner and watched them hook up fluids, watched them wipe dried blood from its coat, the smell of alcohol and disinfectant mixing with the iron tang of old wounds. And for a moment Mary's thin body on a hospital bed returned to me, small and cold in that same way, and the old helplessness that had squeezed me years ago tightened my chest. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Please don't take him away. Not again." Outside, the sky went black, and thunder rolled in the distance. The glass-trembled neon flickered a sick green, and Elaine turned to me and said, "Tonight we'll tell John. Tonight is the decision." I nodded and breathed out, "If need be, I'll stay. I won't leave." She didn't argue. She just laid her hand on my shoulder. For the first time in years, my hands shook, not from the cold, but from something like hope. I looked at the Doberman, black and brown, its head wrapped in a white bandage, breath heavy and slow, and I saw dried blood on its paw like the proof of a fight nobody believed it could survive. It was still alive, and perhaps in that long night so was I. I never thought saving a life could make a man feel both so small and so impossibly large at once, and that night in the tired little clinic with the fluorescent bulbs flickering, and the smell of antiseptic, sharp as alcohol mixed with rust. I sat completely still while the Doberman, unnamed, then lay wrapped in white bandages on the metal table, and every time the monitor let out a soft beep, my chest tightened as if the sound were the pulse of my own soul, fragile but refusing to die. Elaine's voice was hoarse from hours without rest as she told me, "He's got a chance, John, but tonight will tell us if he's left with anything at all." And I only nodded, my eyes glued to the slow, heavy breaths coming from that small, battered body. I was terrified. The vet ordered fluids, high-dose antibiotics, a CT scan of the head, and I understood in a way that stabbed me that none of it came cheap, and when the nurse slid the estimate across the counter, my hands trembled. seeing the penciled line. Deposit $2,300, almost the exact sum I'd been saving to fix the roof before storm season. Elaine looked at me and said softly, "You can wait until morning, John." Sometimes. Letting go is mercy for both, and I turned to her without taking my eyes off the dog and said, "I let go once already. With Mary. I'm not doing that again." I signed my name on the savings book with a hand that shook and felt the ink spread like the dried blood that still clung to the dog's fur. I had in that moment bet the rest of my life on a creature balanced between living and not, and I did it without a second thought, because I was tired of standing there as people left clutching hands and praying while everything slipped away. Elaine began the pain meds and spoke low, warning me he might be comatose for days, and that he didn't need me to stay, that the clinic had nurses on duty. I answered before she finished, "No, I'll stay. He shouldn't wake up in a strange room with no one here." I meant it. I sat through the night on a wooden chair, my hand on the cold edge of the table, watching every tiny shiver like it was a bell ringing inside me, and every time he convulsed, my heart jumped, as though my body reflected his pain. The fever made his coat slick sweat and medication seeping into the bandages, and the metallic bitter odor of it filled the room. At times, Elaine stepped out to make calls, and I was left alone with him and the rain beginning to fall on the tin roof, big, slow drops that sounded like the earth itself exhaling. I thought of Mary in her last days, bald tubes everywhere, eyes begging me not to cry, and I did not cry then, but the weak dip of that monitor beep wet my eyes. Around midnight he seized, and Elaine lunged, shouting, "Hold him," and I pinned his thin legs to the table, while his gaunt muscles shook under my hands, and blood seeped through the bandages, the dark brown of old blood mixing with the IV fluid into a smell so sharp it stole my breath. She jabbed meds, sweat soaking her shirt lips, moving with prayers I hadn't voiced in years, and that for reasons I couldn't name, I found myself mumbling too. "If you took Mary, please let this dog stay. He hasn't had the chance to do anything wrong." The seizure eased. Elaine watched the monitor and let out a long breath. Temporary. For now, he's stable, and I slumped into the chair with fingers still shaking while the rain tapered to wind, and the neon buzz thinned to a greenish hum, and the room smelled of wet earth and tar. I looked at him, sleeping breath slow but even, and something in me softened as though a hand had been laid on my chest and told me it was enough. I reached out and touched his head and said, "You're not alone, I'm here." Outside, Riverside County lightened slowly, the night losing its hold to a weak orange at the horizon, and I sat exhausted, but with a new beat in my chest I'd thought the world took when Mary went. The Doberman was still breathing. And for the first time in many years I had a reason to wake up. 3 days after that night, the clinic felt like it had bent time itself around a single fragile breath. Each hour held careful and silent, as if noise might blow the life away. And I stayed in the wooden chair by the metal table, where the fluorescent light poured a cold, merciless honesty onto everything. The Doberman, I'd started calling him Rex, lay still, each breath a fine thread barely holding him to the world, and every small sound in the room felt enormous. Elaine came in with a hot cup of coffee and said in that low, practiced voice that had seen too much temperatures better, but he's not eating. His stomach's weak, his reflexes slow. We have to go slowly. I nodded and didn't speak. Her experienced eyes met mine while my hands still trembled from fear more than fatigue. The last time I held Mary's hand, it was the same cold and thin, and I had believed that if I simply stayed with her, she would not leave, and I was wrong. This time, I needed to be right. On the 4th day, Rex opened his eyes a narrow slit, but enough for me to know he'd stayed. The look was cloudy and frightened, as if he'd come back from somewhere too dark to trust the light. I bent close and whispered, "It's okay. You're safe now." He did not move much, only blinked once, and a small wet line ran from the corner of his eye. Sweat or tears, I couldn't tell, and my chest tightened like someone squeezing the air out of me. Elaine watched and said softly, "He hears you. Trust me, John. He understands." From that day, I began to stay at the clinic every day. I wiped him with a warm towel, worked through the caked mud and dried blood in slow, steady strokes, and fed him mashed chicken porridge by spoon, like a father coaxing a child who won't eat, and there were times he turned his head away too weak to swallow, but I kept at it, and one morning he licked the spoon. One lick. It felt like a miracle. Over the following days, he reacted more when I came in. His ears twitched, his eyes found me, and the look changed from terror to recognition. Elaine smiled, the small smile of someone who sees something rare and good in this broken world, and told me he picked you, John. After 2 weeks, I took Rex home. My old Chevy coughed and coughed like it always had, but this time there was a life on the passenger seat riding with me across Riverside County's red dust roads, the window down, wind carrying the smell of earth and scorched grass. And for the first time in years, I did not feel alone. My house was simple, a little wooden place with 2 porch chairs and the lavender Mary planted, and I spread a soft blanket in a corner, set out a bowl of water and a plate of food, and let him choose. Rex patted in his step, still uneven, and sniffed the house like a man checking a room for danger, until he settled where I'd laid the blanket and breathed out a long, relieved sound. That night, I sat on the porch while the wind toyed with the wood, the moon silver on the damp grass, and Rex lay with his head on my knee, his breath warm and steady, like the pulse of someone I once loved, who had come back in a different body. Mary used to say, "Some hurts are too deep to fix. You learn to live with them." I didn't believe her then. Now I understood. A week later, he could go into the yard. Every morning, I opened the door, and sunlight hit his black and brown coat like a new streak of light, and I made coffee and listened to the kettle while he nosed at the grass legs, shaky but proud, and when he turned and looked at me, I held my breath. There was no fear in that look anymore, only trust. Elaine came by with medicine and food and said, "You did better than I expected," John and I answered quietly. Not me. He wanted to live. That afternoon, a sudden rain came, and I watched him run through the yard, soaked and fierce, barking loud and clear, as if to tell the world the bad thing was over. And I laughed out loud, a laugh I could not remember how long it had been, since I'd heard like a heart learning to beat again to someone else's rhythm. That night, I left the porch light on. Its warm glow spread over the wet boards, and the puddles that shimmered like small moons, and Rex curled up at my feet with his head on Mary's chair. I said, voice thick, "I thought I saved you, but maybe you saved me." Riverside County slept on only wind and insects and the slow breathing of 2 souls who had nearly lost their faith in the world. Tonight, we both survived. And in that dark, I thought God had given me a second chance, wrapped up in a scrawny Doberman named Rex. 3 months had passed since the day I brought Rex home, and every morning in Riverside County began the same, the distant chirp of crickets light rolling across dry fields, and the soft, steady rhythm of Rex's paws on the porch boards, proud and calm. He had changed, and so had I. His body had healed almost completely, but the miracle wasn't in that. Every time I opened the door, he didn't bolt outside. Like other dogs, he paused, looked at me with eyes that no longer feared, only asking quietly, "May I go?" I nodded, and he ran, drawing circles of joy in the morning sun. In that light, his black and tan coat shimmered like molten copper, the wind brushing over scars that never vanished, just faded into proof that he had survived. When I looked at them, I saw myself wounds that never fully close, but still somehow count as living. I began talking to Rex as if to a person. In the mornings, I told him stories about Mary, the way she always poured her coffee too full, or how she hid cookies behind the flour jar. He listened, head-tilted ears perked, as if each word mattered. Sometimes I laughed. Sometimes I sat in long, soft silences, and in those silences I realized I was no longer alone. One afternoon, while fixing the back fence, a heavy crash split the quiet wood falling, metal clanging sharp. I flinched, but Rex reacted first. He barked low and fierce, lunging between me and the sound, the instinct to protect igniting like a spark. His body was tight as wire, eyes alert but calm. He wasn't the trembling creature in the pool of dried blood anymore. He was a companion, one who chose to stand between me and the world. I laid a hand on his head, felt his warmth and heartbeat. "It's okay, Rex. It's over. No one's going to hurt us anymore." He looked up, eyes wide with something as deep and endless as the Texas sky, sorrow, loyalty, and faith all living in the same gaze. That night, we sat on the porch together, wind sliding through the boards, the scent of damp soil, and insects thick in the air. It had been years since I'd heard silence like that, not the silence of emptiness, but of peace. Elaine still dropped by sometimes. "I've never seen a Doberman recover that fast," she said. "He's bound to you, John." I smiled, maybe because we both know what it feels like to be left behind. One night, rain came slow and heavy. Texas rain thick with the smell of burnt grass and wet clay air dense with memory. I heard Rex whimper from the other room. He trembled, ears down, eyes locked on the door. I knew the rain on the roof sounded too much like those nights he'd been beaten. I sat beside him, my hand on his neck, voice low. "No one's going to hit you again. I promise." He pressed his head against my chest, breath quick but softening. In that moment, I felt it. He trusted me completely and without condition. A creature once beaten half to death could still believe in a man, and a man who had lost everything could finally learn to believe again. In the weeks that followed, I started leaving the house, more to the market on walks, even to the coffee shop where Mary and I used to sit. People looked, nodded, some asked about the dog, some remembered. "You're the old guy who saved that Doberman, right?" One man laughed, pretty bold. "John. Stirring trouble at your age." I said, not bold, just done standing still. In the evenings, Rex and I walked the dirt road that led to the southern fields. Sunset poured down like honey, spilling gold across his back. He turned to look at me, tail gently swaying steps, steady and sure, and I realized how beautiful that sight was, so beautiful it made me want to live long enough to see it again. When we came home, Rex climbed onto the porch bench. Mary's bench tilted his head and stared into the distance. I stood at the doorway, my chest tightening. I don't know if it was the light or memory, but for a heartbeat I saw Mary in his gaze. I whispered, half to the woman I'd lost, half to the life before me. "Thank you, both of you." That night, the sky cleared. The wind carried pine and cricket song through the dark. Rex slept by my feet sometimes, twitching in a dream, and I laid my hand on his back, felt the steady beat of his heart. No more fear, no more emptiness. Only two souls who had relearned how to trust in goodness. Outside, the Texas sky stretched so wide it made every loss seem small, and in that moment, I knew I wasn't just a man who survived. I had become a man who could love again. August, in Riverside County, always burns like the sky's trying to melt memory itself. The air turns dry and thick with scorched earth and pine sap cicadas screaming through the thin peace of every afternoon. I thought I was safe, that every nightmare had already passed. But fate, it seems, always knows how to test a man one more time. That day began like any other. I was changing the water in the back garden when I heard a strangled sound from inside the house, a low, broken moan that froze me. I dropped the watering can, heart pounding. Rex was curled on the kitchen floor, trembling violently, eyes wide and wild. The water bowl beside him spilled across the tiles. I knelt and touched his back. It was burning dry, hard as stone. Rex listened to me. I'm here. But he didn't hear me. He jerked, slammed into the table leg claws, flailing as if fighting some invisible ghost. In his eyes, I saw something ancient. The terror of cages blows, cigarette burns from those drunk nights at the market long ago. He wasn't seeing me. He was staring through me, straight into his past. No, no one's hurting you anymore, I shouted, my voice cracking. My hands shook as I dialed Elaine's number. She answered on the first ring, her tone clipped and calm. Bring him in, John. Might be a fever spike or neural stress. Be careful. Keep him from hurting himself. I wrapped him in a blanket and lifted with everything I had. He was heavier now, stronger but limp like a piece of wood half burned. I laid him on the truck seat and tore down the dirt road, dust storming in the mirrors, sunlight slashing my face and carving lines deeper than I'd ever seen, the same way it had the day I rushed Mary to the hospital for the last time. The same air, the same fear. Elaine and 2 nurses were waiting when I arrived. Machines, freeze, oxygen masks, everything moved fast, precise. Temp 105. Heart rate spiking. Possible seizure. John. I nodded, couldn't speak. Just clenched my fists and begged inside that he'd take one more breath. Rex shook again, his old scars on the chest, surfacing under the harsh light ghosts I thought we'd buried. Elaine looked up. He's reacting to memory, like a nightmare, but the body feels it as pain. I stepped closer, pressed my palm against his chest, slick with sweat. Hear me, Rex. I'm not leaving. No one's hurting you. Not anymore. Elaine injected another dose of sedative, then said quietly, Keep your hand there. Don't move. He needs to feel you. I stood there 2 full hours, my back screaming, legs numb, but I didn't shift an inch. Every time he gasped, I whispered, Breathe, my friend. You're stronger than that fear. The words weren't just for him, they were for me. When night fell, the fever broke. Rex's eyes opened, pupils wide, then slowly tightening. His gaze found mine. It wasn't fear anymore. It was recognition. He knew I was there. I dropped into the chair, tears spilling before I could stop them. Elaine touched my shoulder and said softly, You just helped him survive a memory no medicine could reach. I looked at Rex's steady chest, then up at the bright white ceiling that looked like dawn. I didn't heal him, Elaine, I said quietly. He's the one teaching me how to live again. The next morning, I brought Rex home. We were both exhausted, but when I opened the truck door, he didn't go inside right away. He walked slowly to the lavender bush Mary had planted years ago and lay beside it, breathing deep, eyes closing. I sat next to him, my hand on the dirt, the air filled with the faint scent of purple blooms. You know, Rex, I murmured, voice breaking. This is where she used to pray every morning. I guess it's my turn now. I closed my eyes and said nothing more. The wind moved through my hair, over his back, through the small space between 2 broken lives now mending. And in that stillness, I felt what Mary once told me, healing isn't forgetting. It's staying with the pain until it softens. That night, I lit a candle beside Rex as he slept, the small golden flame trembling, reflected on the scar across his head like a stitch made by fate itself. I sat there with my hands clasped, and for the first time in years, I prayed not for myself, not for the past, but for the soul breathing quietly beside me. And when the flame touched the edge of dawn, I understood something simple and final. I was no longer afraid of loss, because we had both survived dying twice. That year, autumn came early to Riverside County. Every morning, the fence's rooftops, even my shoulders, carried a thin veil of mist when I opened the porch door. The wind smelled of damp soil, the scent of beginnings. Rex ran across the yard, his coat sleek now, the faint scar at his neck like a stitch binding two worlds together, death and life. I sat with my coffee, watching him leap through patches of sunlight scattered across the ground. I no longer saw pain in his shadow, only rebirth. And in him I saw myself. The townsfolk had grown used to the sight of two quiet figures walking down Main Street each morning, an old man with gray hair and a Doberman who'd once nearly died under a drunk man's hand. They joked, "There goes John and his shadow." I just smiled, because they were right. Rex was my shadow. The rhythm of breath I never wanted to lose again. One day, someone knocked on my door. It was Carter, the young officer who'd arrested the abuser that night. He handed me an envelope inside a letter of thanks from the Riverside Animal Rescue Center. "You saved his life, you know," Carter said. I shook my head. "No, we saved each other." He smiled, eyes glistening. "We're starting a small fund to help more cases like his. Would you join us as an advisor? People heard your story, and they believe." I stayed quiet for a long moment, watching Rex lying by the window, sunlight spilling over his back like a promise. "Yes," I said softly. "I'll help. Not for me, for the ones who don't have a voice." From then on, every week, Carter, Elaine, and I held small events at the old market, the same place where it had all begun. We hung photos of Rex before and after, and placed a hand-painted sign that read, "Don't look away. One glance can save a life." People stopped read and grew quiet. Some asked how to donate. Children patted Rex's head, their innocent eyes reflecting a belief that miracles still existed. One elderly woman approached, hands trembling as she placed a wrinkled $10 bill into the box. "I don't have much," she said, "but I know what it's like to be left behind." I held her hand and smiled. "Thank you. Every dollar is a chance to live." The old market, once a place of cruelty, had become a shrine of compassion, and at its center lay Rex's peaceful eyes, half closed like a silent priest presiding over a church of redemption. One evening, I took Rex to the riverbank where I'd once scattered Mary's ashes. The moon hung low, its reflection glittering across the water. Rex walked beside me, his paws pressing small even prints into the damp sand beside mine. I sat and watched the river mirror the moon, and the older, lighter face looking back at me. "Mary," I whispered, "if you can see this." I kept my word. I didn't let go again. The wind stirred, and a dried sprig of lavender slipped from my pocket into the water. Rex lifted his head, gaze distant as if he understood. I rested my hand on his head and murmured, "We were both saved, weren't we, old friend?" He didn't bark, only pressed closer, breathing slow and warm. I sat there listening to the water, to the sound of his heart blending with mine, and I knew we had both found home. Months later, when the rescue fund became official, I returned to the market once more. The spot where that man had beaten Rex was just a cracked patch of cement now. No one remembered his name, but everyone remembered the story of a Doberman who lived and an old man who refused to walk away. Before I left, I took out my pocket knife and carved 2 small words into a wooden post. We lived. Just that. Enough to say everything. That afternoon, the Texas sun burned red as fire spilling through the trees, crowning Rex's back in gold. I watched him run through the open field, tail swaying paws, drumming steady against the earthlight as the heartbeat of someone fully alive. And when he turned and looked at me, eyes, bright mouth curved in what could only be called a smile, I heard myself whisper, "Yeah, Rex." We finally made it. Golden light washed over Riverside County. The wind carrying a faint metallic chime from the sign outside my house, the one Carter and I hung the day the fund was born. It read 3 simple words: "Second chances live." I looked at Rex sleeping on the porch step, his chest rising, slow eyes at peace, and I realized we hadn't just survived. We had come back to life. If you believe every soul deserves a second chance, share this story. Don't look away when you see cruelty, because one glance, one call can save a life. Thank you for staying until the end.